Southern Italy, December 1944. The air smelled like oil, rain, and burned metal. On the edge of a half-flooded runway sat three carcasses of what had once been proud warbirds, P-40 Warhawks, their noses caved in, wings snapped, engines bleeding fluids into the mud. To the brass, they were numbers on a clipboard, write-offs. To the pilots, they were ghosts. But to Sergeant Frank Halley, they were a challenge. He stood ankle-deep in oil and grit, a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other, staring at the wrecks like a gambler studying his cards. He spat, flicked the ash, and muttered, "They'll fly." "Fly?" the crew chief scoffed. "Those birds are dead, Halley. Engines cracked, wings shot to hell. You'd be faster walking them to Berlin." Halley smiled, that lopsided grin that said he'd already decided. "Give me 48 hours. The others laughed. He didn't. The storm rolled in that night, thunder shaking the tents as wind howled through the wreck yard. The mechanics crawled into their bunks, but Halley stayed in the mud, working under the flicker of lightning. He tore open engine cowlings, welded with stolen acetylene tanks, and raided the scrapyard for anything with a pulse. The rules said you couldn't mix engines, couldn't weld fractured spars, couldn't reuse fuel lines from a burnt-out cockpit. He broke all three before midnight. By morning, the base looked like a scene from hell. Sparks flying, hammers ringing, silhouettes moving through smoke. Halley's hands were raw, his face streaked with oil, but the wrecks were changing shape. He stripped one plane's wings to repair another's, bolted a radiator from a truck onto a fighter's underbelly, rewired instruments with copper stripped from abandoned field telephones. When a lieutenant arrived to inspect the unauthorized activity, Halley didn't even look up. "You want planes or paperwork, sir?" The officer hesitated. Rain poured down, hissing on hot metal. "You've got 2 days, then they're scrap." Halley grinned. 2 days is a vacation. By the second night, thunder drowned out the sound of welding. He patched holes with aluminum kitchen trays, mixed engine oil with aviation fuel to test pressure ratios. He didn't follow the manual. He followed the sound. "Engines talk," he'd mutter. "You just gotta listen when they're lying." At dawn, on the 47th hour, the camp woke to a noise none of them expected. A roar, deep and uneven, but alive. One of the wrecks coughed, choked, then thundered into life. Mechanics came running, then another, and another. 3 planes, once written off as dead, now idled in perfect rhythm, exhaust rippling across the mud like applause. Halley stepped out of the smoke, wiping grease from his face. "Guess they weren't done fighting." The lieutenant stared, speechless. "You did this in 48 hours? Halley smirked. 47 and a half. Don't insult me." As the first plane taxied forward, the wind kicked up dust and rain. It wasn't a miracle. It was defiance, born from desperation, stubbornness, and one man's refusal to let good steel die. And when those 3 fighters lifted off, their patched wings glinting under the morning sun, the airfield erupted in cheers. They weren't pretty. They weren't regulation. But they flew. And that meant they were killers again. Military manuals were gospel in 1944. Thick binders printed in Washington and shipped across the Atlantic, filled with neat diagrams and hard rules. Each page ended with the same warning: unauthorized modifications are punishable by court-martial. Sergeant Frank Halley had read those words once. Then he'd used the page to wipe grease off his hands, because war wasn't clean. Manuals didn't account for shrapnel in your toolbox, sand in your engine block, or the fact that the replacement parts promised by Supply Command were sitting in a crate 300 miles away. To the engineers who wrote the rules, repair meant replacement. To Halley, it meant resurrection. He'd been in Italy long enough to see how rules killed faster than bullets. Pilots grounded because a bolt didn't match the serial number. Engines scrapped because someone was too scared to weld. "You can't fix a fighter with scrap," the brass said. "You'll throw off the balance, compromise the frame, risk the man inside. But Halley didn't build for perfection. He built for survival. He scavenged the airfield like a buzzard. Broken propellers became braces. Bullet holes turned into test points. Fuel lines from crashed bombers fed new life into fighters that weren't supposed to run. "Every piece of junk has a pulse if you listen right," he told his crew. To him, the P-40 wasn't a machine. It was a living thing, stubborn and loyal. He could feel its heartbeat through the wrench. He knew when a piston was lying, when a crankshaft was just scared to move again. The younger mechanics watched in awe and confusion. "Sarge," one of them asked, "what if it blows up?" Halley didn't even look up. "Then I fix it faster." He didn't use torque specs. He used instinct. Tighten until it feels right. Stop when the metal hums. He called it combat tuning. One afternoon, a logistics officer caught him welding two different engine mounts together, one from a P-40, another from a wrecked British Spitfire. The officer barked, "That's not regulation material." Halley grinned. "Neither's war, sir." The truth was brutal. The Air Force was running out of everything: aluminum, rubber, manpower, time. Commanders could pretend the system still worked, but men like Halley kept the sky alive by breaking it. In a corner of the hangar, someone had painted a slogan above the rec-yard gate. "If it runs, it flies." The phrase spread across bases like wildfire. It wasn't official, but it was true. To the pilots who climbed into Halley's rebuilt planes, it meant faith. Faith that somewhere behind every miracle takeoff was a man who refused to accept impossible. And for Halley, it meant freedom. Rules kept men safe in peace. But in war, he believed, rules only kept planes on the ground. By the time the brass realized what he was doing, 3 of his illegal rebuilds had already flown and lived. One officer later wrote in a report, "Sergeant Halley's disregard for procedure borders on genius or insanity." He wasn't wrong. Before he was Sergeant Halley, the man who resurrected Rex, he was just Frank from Peoria, Illinois, a farm kid who could fix anything that made noise. His first machine wasn't a plane. It was a tractor that had been dead since the Dust Bowl. His father said it was hopeless, that the engine was cracked beyond repair. Frank was 13 when he tore it apart anyway, patching the fuel line with tin foil and rope. When it coughed back to life, his old man just stared. "How'd you do it?" he asked. Frank grinned. "Didn't know I couldn't." That was his secret. He never learned what impossible meant. He dropped out of high school at 17, worked at a machine shop, then a junkyard. He didn't care about blueprints or brands. To him, metal was metal. All it needed was will. The older mechanics mocked him for using barnyard tricks, but when their welds cracked and his held, they stopped laughing. When war came, he enlisted, figuring engines were engines whether on the ground or in the air. The Army Air Forces made him a mechanic. By the time he shipped out to North Africa, then Italy, he'd fixed everything from jeeps to generators. His tools were half official issue, half scavenged. Wrenches filed from scrap, pliers wrapped in electrical tape, and one hammer that had been broken, welded, and broken again. His nickname came during training. A lieutenant barked, "Where's your wrench, Halley?" He pointed to the crowbar in his hand. "Right here, sir." The name stuck, but wrench wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. He didn't see machines as sacred. He saw them as stubborn animals that needed coaxing. Pilots trusted him because his fixes worked. One flyer swore his engine ran smoother after Halley talked to it for 10 minutes. Another said, "He can hear a misfire 3 hangars away." While most mechanics waited for orders, Halley improvised. His motto was simple: "The book tells you what worked once. I'm telling you what works now." That made him enemies. Officers hated his independence. Inspectors filed reports about his non-standard procedures, but no one could argue with results. Planes that should have been grounded flew. Missions that would have failed launched. In Italy, 1944, his squadron's maintenance chief joked, "If Halley ever goes missing, check the engine room. He probably welded himself into one." And it wasn't far from the truth. He lived for the sound of engines breathing back to life, that sputter, that rumble, that moment when dead steel remembered how to fight. He'd sit there afterward, wiping his hands, whispering like a preacher at a resurrection. "Told you you weren't done yet." Men who served with him said there were two sides to Frank Halley. By daylight, quiet, patient, methodical. By night, possessed, hammering under flickering bulbs, his face blackened with soot. When someone asked why he worked so hard, he just shrugged. Because every plane that doesn't fly means someone dies who didn't have to. That was his mission. Not glory, not medals, just motion. And when the war pushed past Italy and into the heart of Europe, it was men like Halley, the nameless, sleepless miracle workers, who made sure the sky stayed full of wings. By the winter of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces were winning the war in the air, but bleeding for every mile. Bombers were still falling by the dozen. Fighters were wearing out faster than they could be replaced, and mechanics were stretched thinner than the aluminum they patched. At one point, the numbers were brutal. Over 60% of all P-40s and P-47s in the Mediterranean theater were grounded due to mechanical damage. More planes were lost to maintenance failures than to flak. In some squadrons, the average airframe flew less than 40 hours before something cracked, jammed, or burned out. Every flight line was a graveyard of potential. Rows of twisted fuselages, bent propellers, empty fuel tanks full of sand. Supply officers sent cables begging for parts that would never come. Shipment delayed. Await further instruction. Those 5 words killed more sorties than German shells ever could. That's the world Halley worked in. Not a hangar full of spare parts and manuals, but a junkyard under enemy skies. The official solution was triage. Command ordered the destruction of non-repairable planes to salvage usable parts. Mechanics hated it. Watching a fighter that had carried a man home in flames get stripped down and melted was like burning a flag. Halley called it the math of cowards. To him, a broken plane wasn't dead. It was just waiting to be understood. He'd prowl the wreck line at dawn, clipboard in hand, jotting notes on everything the Air Force had given up on. Bent wings, straighten, cracked mounts, reinforce, blown seals, replace with fuel hose and gum. His list wasn't a manifest. It was a resurrection plan. He did the math in his head. 3 wrecks meant maybe 1 full bird. That was the equation of survival. And yet, every fix he made came with risk. The P-40's Allison engine ran hot, too hot. And with his jury-rigged cooling system, one mistake could turn the plane into a flying torch. He knew it. But so did the pilots. They still lined up to fly his rebuilds because they trusted the man more than the manual. On paper, Halley's approach made no sense. But in the war's chaos, it was genius. He didn't think like an engineer. He thought like a survivor. He didn't calculate the odds. He defied them. And it worked, because in that last brutal year, the only thing rarer than parts was time. Every day, command radioed for more sorties. 10 today, 12 tomorrow, 15 by next week. The orders never stopped. So neither did Halley. He once told a fellow mechanic, "If we don't bend the rules, they'll bend our graves." And in a war where time killed as efficiently as bullets, men like him rewrote the arithmetic of victory, trading safety for speed, perfection for persistence. His hangar wasn't a repair bay anymore. It was a factory of miracles, run on adrenaline, coffee, and defiance. By Christmas Eve 1944, 3 impossible planes were flying combat missions again. That's when the pilots started calling them Halley Specials. The brass called them unauthorized. History would call them something else entirely. Proof that desperation is the mother of invention. It started with 3 wrecks. Twisted aluminum, scorched paint, oil seeping from the sand like blood. They were dragged into Halley's corner of the airfield after a raid gone bad. Each one was a corpse. A P-40 with its nose snapped in half, a P-47 missing its tail, and a Lightning with both engines shot out. The brass marked them beyond recovery. Halley didn't see wrecks. He saw pieces. He walked around the first carcass, tapping metal with his wrench like a doctor checking for a pulse. "This one still breathes," he muttered. A corporal stared. "Sir, she's got half a wing missing." Halley smirked. "Then she'll fly half as far." But she'll fly. He didn't sleep for the next 2 days. His crew followed his lead. Bleary-eyed men hammering, welding, scavenging by flashlight. When the power cut out, they worked by firelight. When the generators quit, they hand-cranked tools. The air smelled like gasoline and madness. He used landing gear struts from one plane as wing spars for another, melted down a propeller to forge new rivets. When they ran out of hoses, he stripped hydraulic lines from a wrecked fuel truck. Every fix was illegal. Every fix worked. "Sir, you can't weld that angle," one mechanic warned. "It'll throw off the balance." Halley didn't look up. Balance is a luxury. Flying's the point. By the 30th hour, the first Frankenstein fighter stood upright, ugly, dented, and alive. He hand-started the engine, the prop coughing, spitting flame. The noise was chaos, but it was sound. At the 36th hour, the second came online, its nose patched with scrap steel from a German half-track. It looked like a monster. It was a monster. By the 47th hour, all three were humming. The hangar shook under the roar of engines that weren't supposed to exist. A supply officer arrived, clipboard in hand, and shouted over the noise. "What in God's name is this?" Halley grinned through the smoke. "Inventory correction." At dawn, the pilots showed up, still half asleep. They stared at the patched-together birds. "You're kidding, right? These things'll kill us." Halley wiped his hands on his rag. "Only if you let 'em." No one wanted to go first. Then Captain Miles, a veteran ace, tossed his cigarette, climbed into the cockpit, and said, "If it's got wings, it's mine." The others followed. Engines roared. The airfield trembled. The first plane shot down the strip like a wounded beast, daring the gods to strike it down. The tower expected an explosion. Instead, lift. Against all odds, the Halley Specials took to the air, wobbling, coughing, but flying. The ground crews stood in disbelief as the silhouettes vanished into the dawn. An hour later, they returned, trailing smoke, holes in the fuselage, but victorious. 3 kills between them. Halley watched in silence as they landed, engines sputtering but alive. His crew cheered. He just lit a cigarette and whispered, "Told you she'd breathe." When command heard about it, they were furious. When they saw the results, they were speechless. In 48 hours, one mechanic had done what entire factories couldn't. He hadn't fixed planes. He'd rewritten what broken meant. And as the sun rose over the wreck yard, the air shimmered with the sound of 3 engines that had no right to exist. Proof that war doesn't always belong to the rule followers. Sometimes, it belongs to the madmen who believe dead steel can dream again. Command sent engineers to inspect Halley's rebuilt planes. They came armed with calipers, notebooks, and skepticism, convinced that what they were seeing was some kind of miracle fluke, or worse, a dangerous fraud. What they found instead was physics, twisted, unconventional, but undeniable. The first thing they noticed, airflow. Halley's patchwork welds and mismatched panels looked crude. But they unintentionally created micro-channeling effects, turbulent airflow that reduced drag across damaged surfaces. What the textbooks called inefficiency, reality called speed. Second, structural resonance. By overlapping alloys scavenged from multiple airframes, he'd created flexible load points. Where normal wings cracked under stress, his Frankenstein fighters absorbed shock. Engineers called it lateral fatigue compensation. Halley called it making it less angry. And third, engine harmonics. His mix-and-match intake systems were feeding the Allison engines with unpredictable fuel-air ratios, unstable by regulation but explosively efficient under altitude. It made the planes climb faster and hit harder at high speed, like controlled chaos bottled under a hood. The inspection report read like a contradiction. Design faults, numerous. Mechanical instability, extreme. Combat survivability, extraordinary. Halley didn't argue. He just smiled and said, "Sometimes you fix something by breaking it better." One engineer from right field, a young physicist named Harold Reeves, pulled him aside after the test flights. Reeves was stunned. "You understand you just built a proof of concept for variable resonance dynamics?" Halley blinked. "I understand it flies." Reeves laughed. "You should be in a lab." Halley shrugged. "The sky's my lab." That line spread through the base like gospel. Pilots started requesting Halley mods on their fighters. Little illegal adjustments that made their planes bite harder in a dive or handle better in a turn. The brass tried to stop it, but it was too late. The field mechanics had learned something the manuals never taught. Sometimes perfection dies in design and lives in defiance. The Halley effect, as it came to be whispered, became a symbol of what America did best. Innovation born out of necessity. Even the Germans noticed. When a downed Luftwaffe officer examined the wreckage of a Halley special, he couldn't believe the stress patterns. He reportedly said, "This plane should have fallen apart, but it bent instead." That was the secret. Halley hadn't built perfect machines. He'd built forgiving ones. Planes that could take punishment and still fight back. Machines that matched the men who flew them. Imperfect, unpredictable, but impossible to kill. Back in the hangar, when Reeves asked him how he knew it would work, Halley gave the same grin he'd worn since Illinois. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew it shouldn't not." That's how science looks when written in grease instead of ink. That's how the war was won, not by theory, but by the madmen who never learned the difference between broken and alive. The order came at dawn, a high-risk sortie over the Po Valley. 3 rebuilt fighters, Halley's Frankenstein squadron, were to escort bombers into one of the most heavily defended German corridors left in Italy. It wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. Command didn't trust the planes. They called them experimental to save face. Pilots called them death traps with wings. But to the men who flew them, they were proof that faith could fly. Captain Miles volunteered again. He'd flown one of the first patched birds. "If she held together once," he said, "she'll hold together twice." Halley didn't argue. He just stood there wiping oil from his hands as the engines sputtered to life. "Don't push her too hard," he said. Miles smirked. "That's the whole point." The planes roared down the strip, uneven, ugly, but full of defiance. By 10,000 feet, the bombers appeared in formation ahead, silver streaks against blue. The German radar picked them up within minutes. The sky turned black with flak. The first shell burst close enough to rattle the canopy. One of Halley's fighters took a hit to the wing. Fragments shredded the patchwork steel. But instead of tearing apart, the plane bent. The flexible frame flexed, absorbed the blow, and kept flying. "Still with you," the pilot radioed, voice steady. Then the fighters came. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, a dozen of them diving out of the sun. What happened next became legend. The Halley Mod P-40 climbed faster than anyone thought possible, engines screaming past their design limits. The patchwork wings held. The makeshift propeller, rebalanced by hand and prayer, bit into the air like a blade. Captain Miles banked hard left, pulling into an impossible climb. A German jet tried to follow and stalled. The death trap had just outclimbed the Luftwaffe. Over the radio, laughter crackled. "You seeing this, Sarge? Your monster's dancing." Halley, listening from the ground tower, didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and muttered, "Atta girl." By the end of the mission, all 3 of his rebuilt planes were still airborne. 2 kills confirmed. 1 bomber saved from certain destruction. When they landed, the squadron ground crews surrounded them in stunned silence. These were planes that weren't supposed to fly, let alone fight. Halley walked up to Captain Miles's plane. Smoke poured from the cowling. The patchwork metal glowed orange with heat. Miles climbed out, grinning through soot. "You built a devil, Sarge." Halley looked at the scarred fuselage, tapped it twice with his wrench, and said, "No, I built a survivor." Word of the mission spread fast. Pilots from other squadrons came to see the wrecks that refused to die. Engineers took photos. Command wrote reports. But among the men, the story was simpler. 3 dead planes, 48 hours, 0 losses. And for one brief, impossible moment, war bowed to a mechanic with a wrench, a cigarette, and the refusal to quit. By the time word reached headquarters, Halley's miracle had already grown into legend. But in the halls of command, legends were paperwork problems waiting to happen. 2 days later, a jeep rolled up to the airfield. Out stepped a colonel from the 9th Air Force, crisp uniform, polished boots, and the permanent squint of a man allergic to improvisation. He looked at Halley's hangar and frowned. "Where are your authorized aircraft?" Halley gestured to the 3 fighters lined up on the tarmac, dented, scorched, breathing smoke. "Right there, sir, fresh out of the grave." The colonel didn't smile. "You realize you violated 17 separate maintenance protocols?" "Yes, sir," Halley said, deadpan. 18 if you count stealing the coffee pot to clean carburetors." The colonel's face twitched. "You're lucky these planes came back in one piece." Halley leaned on his wrench. "They came back, sir. That's the point." The conversation went nowhere. Orders were orders. Command opened a formal inquiry into his unauthorized field modifications. For 2 weeks, Halley was grounded. His tools were locked up. His hangar went silent for the first time in months. But even silence can't stop a story. Pilots who'd flown his rebuilds testified that his work had saved their lives. One after another, they wrote reports. The patchwork held. Plane climbed faster than spec. Recommend no punishment. By the time the paperwork reached Washington, the tone had changed. Instead of disciplinary review, it became technical investigation. The Army Air Forces quietly sent engineers to study his methods. They found brilliance hidden under grease, reinforced joints that mimicked stress distribution patterns modern aerospace engineers wouldn't rediscover for decades. One of them, the same Harold Reeves from Wright Field, wrote a confidential memo. "Halley's field improvisations reveal untapped potential for modular repair in combat zones. Recommend adoption for emergency maintenance doctrine. In plain English, turn the outlaw's ideas into policy." They didn't give Halley credit, of course. His name never made the manuals, but his methods did. By spring 1945, new field guidelines included combat adaptive repair protocols, a sanitized way of saying, do what Halley did if it keeps you alive. Meanwhile, back at the airfield, he returned to his tools like nothing happened. The colonel stopped by one evening. "You know, Sergeant," he said, "you caused quite a stir. Washington's rewriting the book because of you." Halley didn't look up from his engine. "Figures. They always fix it after it's broken." The colonel hesitated. "They want to send you home for debriefing." Halley shook his head. "Not till the sky's quiet." He stayed until the war's end, still working, still welding miracles out of ruin. Years later, when the Air Force began designing the first jet-age maintenance protocols, they unknowingly used his principles: modular repairs, cross-component tolerance, adaptive field engineering. No medals, no ceremonies. Just a footnote in a classified report that ended with one line. These procedures originated from a non-standard mechanic in theater, 1944. His solutions were technically illegal and entirely correct. April 1945. The war was ending, but the machines didn't know it yet. The airfield in northern Italy was quiet, the sky mostly clear. except for one P-47 sitting alone at the end of the strip, its fuselage blackened from a fuel fire, canopy shattered, right wing half gone. The brass said to scrap it. "It's done, Halley, the war's over anyway." But Halley wasn't built to leave something dead. He stood there staring at the wreck in the fading sun, his hands in his pockets, the smell of oil still thick in the air. "She got someone home," he said quietly. "That means she earned one more shot." For 2 days he worked alone. The others packed, cleaned, turned in their gear. He scavenged from abandoned crates, stripped the last of the usable panels off wrecks, melted down shell casings for bolts. This wasn't about orders anymore. It wasn't even about war. It was about what he believed, that nothing deserved to die if it still had the will to move. When the final weld cooled, he stepped back. The plane looked like a ghost, part steel, part scar tissue. He climbed into the cockpit, hands trembling slightly. For the first time, there was no pilot waiting. This time, he'd fly her himself. The tower refused clearance. He didn't ask again. He throttled up. The patched propeller screamed. The P-47 shook like it remembered every bullet it had ever taken. Then, against reason, against gravity itself, it lifted off. For 5 minutes, he circled the field. Just one man and one machine refusing to accept peace as an excuse to stop fighting. When he landed, the crew ran out, shouting, laughing, cursing. He cut the engine, the propeller slowing to silence. "Why'd you do it, Sarge?" someone asked. Halley just smiled, eyes glassy from the wind. "Because she could." That night, he wrote a letter home, the only one anyone ever found. "I fixed planes so they could fly, not because someone told me to. If a thing's still got a spark in it, you don't walk away. You give it air. You let it breathe. Maybe that's all life really is." The war ended weeks later. His last repair never flew again. They left it at the edge of the airstrip, too heavy to move, too sacred to scrap. Years later, when engineers visited the old Italian base, they found it still sitting there, rusted, silent, and whole. On the engine cowling, someone had etched 2 words in the metal, barely legible under the grime. "Still flying." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who wrote it. After the war, Sergeant Frank Halley vanished back into the quiet. The kind of man history never remembers, but the world keeps running because of. He didn't join the new Air Force. He didn't chase medals or headlines. He went home to Illinois, bought a small garage off Route 6, and fixed tractors again. People in town said he was strange. He never talked about the war. But they noticed something. He treated every broken thing like it mattered. A farmer would bring in a rusted combine, certain it was scrap, and Halley would just nod. "She'll breathe again." 2 days later, it would rumble to life. Same tone, same faith, same fire. Sometimes kids would wander into his shop and ask about the photos on the wall. Black and white snapshots of men beside half-melted planes smiling through smoke. He never called them heroes. He called them believers. When a local reporter once asked what his secret was, he said, "Machines are honest. They tell you when they've had enough. You just have to decide if you believe them." Decades later, one of his old pilots, Captain Miles, tracked him down. He'd heard rumors about the mechanic who made death fly backward. They sat in the garage, 2 old men surrounded by tools, grease, and silence. Miles looked around. "You could have been rich, Halley. You invented half of modern field engineering." Halley shrugged. "Didn't invent it. Just refused to stop doing it." Miles smiled. "You ever miss it? The sky?" Halley paused, looking at the sunlight spilling through the window. "Every day," he said. "But it's all right. The sky is just a mirror. You keep fixing things down here, you're still up there." After he died in 1968, his tools were donated to a small aviation museum. One mechanic, an old airman who recognized the name, opened the rusted toolbox and found a folded piece of paper taped inside the lid. It said, "Regulations end when survival begins. If it runs, it flies." Today, historians still argue whether Sergeant Halley's field modifications truly changed the course of aerial warfare. Some call him reckless, others call him visionary. But the pilots who flew his planes? They called him something simpler. They called him the man who refused to quit. Because when the manuals failed, when the parts ran out, when the sky itself said no, he made it say maybe, and sometimes maybe was enough to win a war.